You're walking down the street feeling calm, focused, centered, and then suddenly someone cuts you off, insults you, challenges your intelligence or your beliefs. Your chest tightens. Your jaw clenches. That little flicker of heat begins to rise behind your eyes. We've all been there. And the moment it happens, you know you're about to lose control. But what if I told you that you could train your brain, not just to resist the anger, but to literally rewire how it responds to provocation? At Stanford, this isn't about ignoring your emotions or pretending to be unbothered. This is neuroscience, it's biology, and it's something you can harness. There's a region in the brain called the amygdala. It acts like an alarm system. It's fast, it's reactive, and it evolved to keep you alive. But here's the truth. In most modern situations, especially interpersonal ones, your amygdala is overfiring. It's misfiring. And every time you get angry at someone, whether it's a stranger online, a coworker, or even someone close to you, you're reinforcing that reactive circuit. But there's a more powerful system you can activate. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for deliberate thought, executive function, and long-term planning, can inhibit the amygdala. It can put the brakes on that emotional cascade if you train you to it. So the first step is physiological, and it's surprisingly simple. Double inhale through the nose, long exhale through the mouth. What you're doing is rebalancing carbon dioxide and oxygen in the bloodstream, directly impacting your stress response instantly. You're not meditating. You're not philosophizing. You're using your body to take control of your brain. You're creating space between stimulus and response. Space is power. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Neurals at Stanford. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, only happens when you're in a state of heightened alertness and you choose a different response. So every time someone triggers you and you feel the rise of anger, but you pause, breathe, and don't react, you're physically changing your brain. You're weakening the anger circuit. You're strengthening the calm, rational one. That's not suppression. That's transformation. Now let's talk about perspective. Because neuroscience shows that what you focus on, what you narrate, literally shapes your emotional experience. If someone insults you and your inner monologue is, how dare they? You're pouring gasoline on the fire. But if your inner monologue becomes, this is a chance to train, to stay in control, to lead. Now you've reframed the moment, and that framing, again, through the prefrontal cortex, begins to dictate your emotional baseline. And here's something even deeper. The most resilient people, the most unshakable minds, aren't the ones who never feel anger. They're the ones who recognize it, witness it, and redirect it. They have trained themselves through repeated exposure to remain the observer, not the reactor. So if you want to stop being bothered by people, don't aim to suppress anger. Aim to build a nervous system so well regulated that you can feel the flame of irritation rise, and then watch it dissolve. You want to become the kind of person who walks through the world with a mind that's unshakable, not because the world is peaceful, but because you've built the biology for peace. Most people believe anger is just part of who they are. I have a short temper, they say, or I've always been like this. But that's not true, not in terms of how the brain works. Anger is not a personality trait. It's a biological response. It's your nervous system doing what it was designed to do when it perceives threat or disrespect. And the part of the brain that drives this is the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe. It's incredibly fast. It picks up on facial expressions, tone of voice, and even subtle shifts in body language before you're even consciously aware of them. That's why you can feel angry before you even understand why. But here's the critical piece. Just because something is biological doesn't mean it's permanent or unchangeable. In fact, the brain is incredibly plastic. It rewires itself based on experience and repetition. So every time you say, I'm just an angry person, you're reinforcing a myth. You're not angry. You're trained to react with anger. That training might have come from your environment, your childhood, your social group, but it's still just that training. And anything that's trained can be retrained. What this means is that anger is not something that happens to you. It's a pattern your brain learned to follow. And once you understand that, you gain leverage. You gain the ability to change it, not through force, not through suppression, but through deliberate neurological rewiring. You stop seeing anger as a fixed identity, and you start seeing it as a signal, one that you can observe, intercept, and transform. That's how high performers do it. That's how emotional resilience is built, not by ignoring the biology, but by understanding it and using it to your advantage. Now, once you understand that anger is just a neural pattern, not a fixed personality trait, the next logical step is recognizing that you can train your brain to respond differently. And this isn't just a mindset shift. This is something that's backed by decades of research in neurobiology and psychology. The key player here is your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain right behind your forehead. It's responsible for executive functions of decision-making, impulse control, planning. And most importantly in this context, it's the structure that can inhibit the amygdala. Think of it like this. The amygdala is the accelerator. The prefrontal cortex is the brake. When someone says something offensive or disrespectful and you feel that rush of heat, your amygdala is firing fast. But if your prefrontal cortex is well-trained, well-regulated, and active, it steps in and says, hold on, we don't need to react to this. And when it does that consistently over time, you're not just avoiding conflict, you're rewiring the entire circuitry of how you process stress. This is why practices like controlled breathing, mindfulness, cold exposure, and even certain types of resistance training are so effective. They all engage the prefrontal cortex under controlled stress, which builds its strength like a muscle. You're not just calming yourself down in the moment. You're building a structural advantage in your brain that makes you less reactive, more measured, more composed across the board. This rolls at Stanford. So when we talk about emotional regulation, we're not talking about suppressing what you feel. We're talking about training the neurological mechanisms that allow you to choose your response. You are not at the mercy of your instincts. You have a system built for override. But like any system, it needs training, and the reps happen in real-world moments. The tension in a conversation, the snide comment, the disrespectful tone, those aren't triggers to react to. They're opportunities to train your brain into something stronger. When we think about controlling our emotions, most people instinctively go to mental strategies. Think positive. Let it go. Don't take it personally. But here's what the science actually shows. The fastest way to shift your emotional state isn't through your thoughts. It's through your body. Your nervous system doesn't start in your brain. It runs throughout your entire body. And the most direct, immediate access point to that system is your breath. There's a very specific pattern. Double inhale through the nose, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth. This isn't a trick. This is rooted in real human physiology. What you're doing in that moment is engaging a system of tiny air sacs in the lungs called alveoli. When you take that second, shorter inhale after the first, you're popping more of them open. That allows for a more efficient oxygen and carbon dioxide. And the long exhale that signals to your brainstem, to your autonomic nervous system that the threat has passed, that you're safe, that you're in control. At Stanford, the reason matters in the context of anger or being emotionally triggered is because when you're in a reactive state, your body is flooded with signals of stress, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, tension in the muscles. Your brain interprets those physical cues as confirmation that something's wrong. It's a feedback loop. But when you intervene at the level of the body, when you consciously change your breathing pattern, you interrupt that loop. You break the cycle. And here's what's wild. You don't need 10 minutes. You don't need a quiet room. One or two of these physiological sides can change your internal state in under 60 seconds. That's faster than any thought-based technique. You're using your biology as a tool. And when you do that consistently, in real time, under pressure, you begin to recondition your brain to handle stress without spiraling into anger. This is what regulation feels like, not detachment, but control. It's not about ignoring the situation. It's about staying so in command of your physiology that your mind doesn't get hijacked by it. Now, here's where things get even more compelling, because it's not just about calming yourself in the moment. It's about rewiring your brain for long-term change. This is the principle of neuroplasticity. And it's one of the most powerful concepts in all of neuroscience. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change in response to experience. But, and this is critical, it doesn't happen when you're comfortable. It doesn't happen when you're relaxed. It happens when you're in a heightened state of alertness and you choose a different response than your default. So what does that mean in real life? It means the moments when you feel triggered. When someone says something disrespectful, when your body starts to go into fight or flight, when your mind screams, react. Those are the moments that matter most. Because if in that moment at Stanford, you pause, if you breathe, you don't react, then you're not just avoiding conflict. You're sending a signal to your nervous system that the old pattern is no longer useful. And that's when the brain starts pruning away those reactive circuits and strengthening new ones. You're literally carving a different neurological pathway through the forest of your own brain. Think of it like this. Every time you resist the urge to snap back, to escalate, to let anger drive your behavior, you're performing a rep, just like in the gym. And just like the gym, one rep won't do much. But over time, you build capacity, you build strength. The circuitry that used to light up automatically in response to stress starts to dim, and the circuitry associated with pause regulation and control becomes dominant. So in the moment, it might feel like you're just staying quiet or holding your breath, but what you're really doing is building a new version of yourself. At the neural level, you're not suppressing your emotion. You're retraining your brain to respond intelligently instead of instinctively. That's how mastery is built, not through theory, but through repeated exposure and the choice to respond with intention again and again. Now, let's talk about something that might be the most underrated but most critical part of emotional control, the space between stimulus and response. Most people don't even realize it exists. Someone says something triggering, your heart rate spikes, your mind reacts, and before you know it, you've already snapped, argued, escalated. Feels instantaneous.
But
the truth, there's always a gap. It might only be a fraction of a second, but it's there. And if you can learn to find it, you can learn to expand it. That space is where self-control actually lives. From a neuroscience standpoint, what's happening in that space is a battle between your limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which wants to react fast and emotionally, and your prefrontal cortex, which governs logic, long-term thinking, and restraint. When you don't train this system, the amygdala wins. But when you consistently engage the prefrontal cortex in high-stakes moments, you literally slow the whole system down. You teach your brain that immediate reaction is not required for survival. And that's where power comes from, not the power to dominate others, but the power to choose your behavior with precision. Think of it like creating a buffer zone in your nervous system. Someone throws emotional chaos at you, and instead of absorbing it and reacting reflexively, you catch it midair. You analyze it. You ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Is this even about me? You begin operating not from a place of defense, but from control. And here's the fascinating part. When you stretch that space even slightly, the emotional charge starts to dissipate. You no longer feel like a slave to what's happening around you. You're now shaping your internal state based on choice, not habit. And the longer you train this ability, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, that space isn't just a pause. It becomes a command center. It's where you kind of decide what kind of person you want to be, how you want to respond, and how much ownership you're going to take over your own state. You're no longer reacting to the world. You're responding to it intentionally, neurologically, and with full authority over your system. What most people misunderstand about emotional control, especially when it comes to anger, is they think the goal is to suppress it, to push it down, ignore it, bottle it up. But suppression is not regulation. In fact, from a neurobiological perspective, suppression can actually increase the stress response over time. When you suppress emotion, especially something as physiologically active as anger, you're forcing your brain and body into a kind of internal conflict. One part of your system is firing up, ready for action, and another part is trying to shut it down. That tug of war doesn't lead to calm. It leads to chronic tension, increased cortisol, and over time, emotional volatility that leaks out in other areas of your life. But transformation, that's a completely different process. You're not pretending the emotion isn't there. You're acknowledging it fully. You're observing the physiological shifts, heart rate, breathing, body heat posture. And then you're guiding your system into a different response. That's self-directed adaptation. That's active regulation. And it's far more effective than just trying to stay calm or not lose it. You're not forcing the nervous system into silence. You're redirecting its energy. And here's something incredibly important. Anger, when channeled through a regulated system, can actually become a source of clarity, of assertiveness, even of purpose. It stops being destructive and starts becoming directional. But you only get access to that when you stop trying to suppress the signal and instead learn how to interpret it and move through it with awareness. So next time you feel that charge, don't fight it. Don't bury it. Step into it with curiosity. Recognize that what you're experiencing is not a threat. It's an opportunity. A moment where your biology is giving you something to work with. And the moment you shift from suppression to transformation, you go from being at the mercy of emotion to being the operator of it. You stop reacting like a triggered system and start responding like a trained one. There's another layer to all of this that's absolutely essential, and it has to do with something most people overlook. Narrative. What you say to yourself in the moments after you get triggered isn't just inner dialogue. It's neurochemistry. Your self-talk, your internal framing, quite literally shapes your emotional landscape. It determines whether your brain stays in a reactive loop or shifts into regulation and control. Let's break this down neurologically. When someone insults you or challenges you, your limbic system lights up. That's the emotional machinery. Fast, primal, and powerful. But right behind it is your default mode network and your prefrontal cortex. These areas start constructing meaning, context, story. They ask, what does this mean about me? What should I do with this? And that story, whether it's empowering or disempowering, begins to dictate your physiology if your self-talk is. They're disrespecting me. I can't let them get away with this. You amplify the emotional response, you reinforce the threat. Cortisol spikes, adrenaline rises, your vision narrows, and the whole system gets hijacked. But if you change that narrative consciously, everything shifts. If the story becomes, this is training, this is a moment to reinforce control. Or, this person's behavior is a mirror of their internal state, not a reflection of my worth. Now your brain engages completely different circuitry. The emotional charge drops. Your decision-making improves. Your identity becomes rooted in stability, not reactivity. And here's the powerful thing the brain can't not assign meaning. It's wired to create narrative in every moment, and research roll at Stanford. The only question is whether you're let that narrative run unconsciously, or whether you're choosing it with intention at Stanford, because whichever one you feed becomes the dominant circuit. That's Hebb's log neurons that fire together, wire together. So in the exact moment where most people spiral into anger or frustration, you can use narrative as a tool. Not to lie to yourself at Stanford, but to reframe the experience into one that serves your regulation and your growth. You're not just thinking differently. You're literally instructing your nervous system to operate under a new paradigm. That's what makes the difference between someone who's easily bothered and someone who walks through chaos with calm precision. One is a prisoner of their inner dialogue. The other is the author of it. Now, a common misconception about emotional regulation is that the ultimate goal is to never feel anger in the first place. But here's the truth. It's not about avoiding emotions. It's about learning to stay in control when you feel them. Anger, frustration, irritation. They are all natural human responses. They are part of your biological makeup. The idea that we should never feel them is unrealistic. And trying to suppress anger entirely often makes it worse. It creates a kind of internal conflict where you push the emotion down only for it to come back even stronger later on, often in unhealthy ways. The key is not to avoid the feeling of anger, but to develop the capacity to witness it without letting it hijack your actions. The highest performers, the most resilient individuals are not those who never get angry. They're the ones who can recognize the anger, acknowledge it, and then make a conscious decision about what to do next. The ability to feel the emotion without becoming it, that's what emotional resilience looks like. Think of anger like a wave in the ocean. It rises, it crests, and then it dissipates. If you try to hold on to the wave, or worse, try to fight it, it becomes overwhelming. But if you simply allow it to rise and fall, you remain centered, unaffected by the ebb and flow. The trick is to create that same kind of relationship with your emotions. You allow them, but you don't get swept away by them. From a neurobiological standpoint, this is about cultivating what's called emotional flexibility. Your brain learns that just because a feeling arises doesn't mean it has to control you. And the more you practice this, the more you allow the full spectrum of emotions without fear or resistance, the stronger your emotional regulation becomes. It's like building mental and physiological muscle. You're not trying to erase the experience of anger. You're strengthening the neural circuits that let you sit with it, observe it, and move through it without losing your composure. When you can feel anger without being consumed by it, you realize something profound. You are not your emotions. You are the observer of them. And this shift in identity changes everything. It gives you the ability to choose, moment by moment, how you show up. Not as a victim of your feelings, but as the intentional creator of your responses. In a world where stress is everywhere and people constantly test your patience, one of the most powerful shifts you can make is realizing that while you can't control other people, you can absolutely control how you respond to them. This is critical to understand because the truth is, most of the time we feel triggered or upset not because of what other people do, but because of how we interpret their actions. People can say things that are rude, passive, aggressive, or outright disrespectful, but in the end, how we react out is a choice. And the more you train your brain to recognize this, the less power these situations hold over your emotional state. From a neurological perspective, your brain is constantly scanning the environment, predicting potential threats or rewards. When someone insults you or challenges you, it's not just about the words or actions. It's about how your brain interprets them in that moment. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotional responses, is highly sensitive. It doesn't know the difference between a real threat, like an actual danger, and a perceived threat, and like an insult. So when someone cuts you off in traffic or throws a jab your way, your brain goes into alert mode. But here's the key. If you don't let the amygdala hijack your system, you can actively reshape your response. You can control the other person's behavior, but you control the environment inside your mind. Every time someone triggers you and you don't react, every time you pause, breathe, and make a conscious decision about how you want to respond, you are teaching your brain that the external world no longer dictates your inner state. You create your own inner environment regardless of the chaos around you. Over time, you build the capacity to stay grounded, calm, and composed because your internal narrative shifts. You no longer rely on the external world to create your sense of peace. You become the source of it. This doesn't mean you suppress or avoid conflict or that you become passive. On the contrary, it means you gain the freedom to respond deliberately. You are no longer just a reaction to the outside world. Instead, you become the creator of your own emotional reality, no matter what's happening around you. At Stanford, the person who can stay unshaken in the face of chaos isn't someone who has an easy life. They're someone who has trained their nervous system to be resilient, to remain steady even in the most turbulent of situations. And when you consistently practice this, the world starts to look different. People may try to upset you, but they'll never have the same power over you again. The idea that emotional resilience happens overnight is one of the biggest misconceptions. It's not a switch you can flip, and it's certainly not a passive process. Building true emotional mastery is a deliberate, daily practice. Just like you wouldn't expect to build muscle without lifting weights consistently, you cannot expect to develop emotional regulation without subjecting yourself to the stresses of life in a controlled, intentional way. This doesn't mean you seek out chaos, but it does mean you put yourself in situations where you're tested and you respond with control, not reaction. This is where deliberate exposure and repetition come into play. Every time you face something stressful, whether it's a challenging conversation, a difficult person, or a situation that stirs up frustration, you are training. You don't just survive the moment, you use it as an opportunity to refine your ability to stay composed. The more often you choose to stay calm, pause before reacting, and engage the prefrontal cortex in these stressful moments, the stronger those neural circuits become. The brain, through neuroplasticity, begins to adjust. It gets better at not getting triggered. It gets better at creating that space between stimulus and response. Now, this isn't a one-time fix. It's a process. It's the accumulation of small, deliberate actions over time that leads to lasting change. Think of each difficult interaction as a rep. Every time you catch yourself from reacting, every time you pause, breathe, and shift your mindset, you're reinforcing a pathway that becomes more automatic with each repetition. This is why high performers consistently train in stressful situations. They aren't born calm. They've built that capacity through consistent exposure and intentional response. The more you practice, the more you increase your tolerance to emotional stress. And remember, this is a lifetime commitment. Emotional resilience doesn't come from a few successful moments. It comes from turning those moments into a pattern, into a habit that you continually refine. At Stanford, the beauty of this is that as you get better at responding to stress with intention, you begin to experience a profound shift, not just in your emotional state, but in the quality of your life. You stop being overwhelmed by your emotions. Instead, you become the master of them. It's not about avoiding stress or discomfort. It's about becoming so comfortable with the discomfort that it no longer has the power to derail you.